I never imagined that my online art project would spiral so spectacularly out of control. It was supposed to be a creative experiment, a sanctuary where I poured my feelings and tangled thoughts into a medium that both expressed and concealed. But it became something much more tangled, more dangerously real before I even noticed. I am an artist, not one of those polished, predictable types who paint sunlit flowers or seascapes with canned profundity, but someone who draws from a well of dark, intensely personal inspiration. My art is digital, created with the touch of a stylus, a symphony of pixels and code, where I piece together faces and expressions as if I'm stitching fragments of my soul. Men are my subjects, each portrait a distillation of some potent, intimate memory. The only rule I follow is that every face, every smirk, every brushstroke has to feel utterly real, has to capture that raw electricity of my own fleeting connections. This was never supposed to be about any one man, but it always felt like every piece was about someone. It started innocently, or so I thought, with an idea to fuse love and art. I created a website, a digital gallery of sorts, where I shared these images under an ambiguous name, Visages of Desire. Each piece had a title, each portrait was paired with a brief, poetic description, and each one was inspired in small or large part by a real man in my life. I didn't name names, I simply absorbed them. Fragments of conversations, late-night texts, secrets exchanged in whispers, or even just a look across the room that lingered a little too long. These things fed into my work, giving each face a ghostly authenticity. At first, my portraits were sporadic. When I was involved with someone, I'd dive in deep, spending hours on each piece, until the virtual man on my screen felt as real as the flesh and blood version. The men themselves, whether old friends, new lovers, or people I'd barely begun to know, never saw the images. They only heard my coy, veiled descriptions, little hints that they had inspired me. They believed it too. How could they not? I'd weave my words carefully, crafting a narrative just for them, making them feel singularly, passionately important. The charm lay in ambiguity, in that sliver of mystery. With each new man who entered my orbit, I played a subtle game. I'd reveal just enough about my artistic process to hook them, yet never enough to make it obvious that they were just one of many. And they all fell for it, captivated by the idea that they alone were the muses of my work. Each man, wrapped in his own pride and desire, imagined himself as my one and only inspiration. It felt thrillingly indulgent, dangerous even. I thought I was in control, until the day my work went viral. It happened fast, like wildfire. One morning, I woke up to find my website exploding with new traffic. The comments section buzzed with strangers' admiration, speculation, and fascination. At first, I felt exhilaration, an artist's high. Here it was validation. But that rush soured the moment I realized just how many people, strangers and otherwise, were connecting the dots I thought I'd hidden. The portraits, once private symbols of my hidden romances, were now public. Worse, the men who inspired them started noticing and commenting. My phone was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Messages piled in, one after the other, each a variation on a theme. Is this me? How could you? I thought I was special. My heart dropped. It was like standing in a gallery with all my naked secrets exposed, while the subjects of my art, my so-called muses, watched in stunned betrayal. But it didn't stop there. Screenshots of my website spread across social media, with users commenting on the uncanny, almost eerie familiarity of the portraits. They speculated wildly about the identities of these men, tracing back details from the captions, dissecting every ambiguous hint. People created fan theories and speculative identity reveals that drew more attention, more unwanted scrutiny. It was my own little web of secrecy, blown wide open for the world to see. And of course the men, my muses, were furious. Each felt duped, betrayed, like they were simply a face in a series of rotating inspirations. One by one they confronted me. Some did it with hurt in their eyes, some with anger simmering just beneath the surface, and some with an unnerving sense of disbelief. The fragile connections I'd carefully cultivated unraveled as each one realized he wasn't my only muse, but part of a patchwork quilt of my desires, fantasies, and secrets. I tried to explain, to tell them that each of them did mean something, that the art was real, that their roles as muses weren't lies, just pieces of a larger truth. But the damage was done. They felt cheap and reduced, like props in some elaborate self-indulgent performance. I was left alone. My carefully curated virtual gallery transformed into a haunted hall of broken connections. Each portrait, once so beautiful and vibrant, now felt like a lingering ghost of what could have been if I hadn't been so reckless, so greedy for inspiration. I was left to sit in the ruins of my art, staring at the faces of the men I'd once loved in my own strange way, each one gazing back at me with eyes full of questions I would never be able to answer. In the days that followed, my life blurred into a haze of regret, anger, and a gnawing loneliness. I hadn't realized how accustomed I'd grown to that twisted sense of companionship. Each man had been like a fleeting melody, a variation that fed my creativity, the harmonies and dissonances sparking life in my art. Without them, my world felt eerily silent, void of the echoes that had once inspired me. I spent hours rereading the comments on my website, as though maybe somehow a different perspective would make it all less painful. But the words didn't change. Each comment and message was a testament to their disillusionment, all variations of the same theme. I'd betrayed them, used them, wrapped them in the guise of intimacy only to strip it away for the sake of my art. When one of them, Marcus, called me late one night, I nearly let it go to voicemail. But something made me pick up. His voice on the other end was quiet, drained of the warmth it had once held. "How could you do it, Valerie?" he asked. There was no anger left, just a hollow sadness that settled in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't have an answer. All I could offer was a weak. "It was art, Marcus. You inspired me. Did you ever actually care about me?" His question hit me with the force of a punch, and I sat there speechless. Because in that moment I realized I had no idea. Had I cared about Marcus, or had I cared about the rush he gave me, the inspiration he stirred in my blood like fire? It wasn't love, it was an obsession with the feeling he evoked, an addiction to the way he made me feel when I created. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I thought I did. But maybe I was too focused on capturing the feelings, on creating something beautiful. Maybe I lost sight of you in the process." He sighed, and it sounded like the end of something. "Then I was just a canvas to you, wasn't I?" I wanted to say no, but all I managed was a small broken whisper. "I'm sorry." After that, the calls stopped. Each one of them must have talked, confided in each other, realizing that they were not alone in their disappointment. Slowly, the silence grew, and I was left in a self-imposed exile. There was a strange clarity to it, a horrifying honesty that forced me to face the truth about myself. I had been so consumed by my need to create, to capture each man's unique essence, that I'd forgotten that they were more than just muses. They were real flesh and blood, with hearts and feelings I'd broken in my pursuit of artistic perfection. I stopped painting for a while. My fingers would freeze above the tablet, hesitant, trembling. I couldn't bring myself to start again, to shape another face that might hold some small, unintentional echo of one of them. It felt wrong, as though I was betraying them all over again by even attempting it. And yet I couldn't leave art behind. One night, in the thick of that silence, I sat down, opened my design software, and stared at the blank screen. My mind drifted unbidden to each of them. Marcus, with his laugh that filled every room. Nathan, whose quiet presence grounded me. Daniel, who could make a dull day feel electric. I missed them all, but it wasn't the same kind of yearning I'd felt before. It wasn't the need to capture them, to mold their likenesses into art. I missed them as they were, missed the reality, not the fantasy. In that moment, I understood what I had to do. I began drawing that night, but it wasn't like before. I abandoned the intense, surrealistic style I'd been so known for. This time, I focused on details I'd overlooked, the little things I'd missed in my quest for perfect imagery. I sketched Marcus's lopsided grin, Nathan's serious eyes softened in moments of laughter, Daniel's thoughtful gaze as he listened. I drew them as they were, not as I wanted them to be, not as I'd remembered or imagined. Each piece was painfully real, every stroke a confession of the ways I'd failed to truly see them when they were with me. The pieces weren't polished. They were messy, raw, stripped down to simple lines and shapes. I knew they weren't technically perfect, that they lacked the allure of my earlier work. But they were honest, something I'd been too cowardly to offer before. As I sketched, I felt something shift within me. A weight lifting, a release of that tightly coiled guilt and shame. I wasn't trying to capture their essence anymore. I was letting go. When I was done, I put them up on the site without fanfare, without the poetic captions that had once adorned each image. Instead, I wrote something simple, something genuine for those I failed to see. And then I left it alone. The response was quieter this time. The viral spectacle had faded, but the ones who remained, the ones who still visited the site despite everything, seemed to understand. Some commented with supportive words. Others expressed a sense of closure, even forgiveness. A few of the men reached out, and while the conversations were hesitant, strained, I sensed that a sliver of understanding had bridged the distance between us. They hadn't forgiven me, not entirely, but they saw that I'd changed, or at least that I was trying to, and somehow that was enough. Months passed and I returned to creating art, though it was different now. Each piece felt more intimate, but not in the way it had before. It was softer, more focused on the everyday beauty of the world around me, of people as they were, not as projections of my desires, but as individuals with their own depths, their own complexities. Sometimes I'd think of them, my muses, as I painted, and a part of me would ache with the bittersweetness of those memories. But I knew better now than to chase that ache, to let it consume me. My art, once an escape, had become something more grounded, something truer. And so I moved forward, carrying the weight of what I'd done, but also the knowledge of what I'd learned. For the first time in my life, I was at peace with my work, not because it was flawless or viral, but because it was real. And as I continued to paint, I felt that the faces I created were no longer shadows of lost loves or fleeting passions. They were reflections of a world that I was finally truly beginning to see. Time drifted by in subtle currents after those final portraits went live. My once bustling inbox had fallen quiet, and the empty space left behind by those men, my former muses, stretched out like an unfamiliar emptiness. It was a silence both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the bridges I'd burned and the lives I'd touched, then fractured, for the sake of fleeting inspiration. I suppose I could have closed the website, walked away from the whole ordeal and started over. But something kept me tethered to it, even as its popularity waned. Maybe it was penance or the hope of redemption in the face of my mistakes. I felt bound to the work, to the vulnerability I tried to inject into my last pieces, the pieces that were finally for them. And there in that quiet space I thought I'd find peace, maybe even a chance to redefine myself as an artist, now stripped of the game I'd played with their trust. But peace has a way of slipping through your fingers when you expect it, and soon enough, the stillness began to itch at me. It was during one of those restless nights, when I found myself scrolling through my portfolio, that I got a message, an unexpected email, tucked away at the bottom of my inbox. The name wasn't familiar, but the tone was earnest, tentative, like the writer was uncertain of where the lines lay. "Your work," he wrote, "feels like a confession, one that resonates with me. I see something honest in it, like you're reaching for forgiveness. Maybe you've heard this already, but I just wanted you to know that your art." It moved me in ways I didn't expect. It was strange, unexpectedly intimate. This stranger, whoever he was, didn't know me, didn't know the real story behind the pieces, the men I'd hurt, the truths I'd twisted into my work. But somehow he saw me in it. A glimpse of the journey I'd been on, the internal chaos, the need to find redemption in the wake of my missteps. Something about his words struck me in a way I hadn't felt in months, a gentle spark of connection that I'd almost forgotten could exist. I hesitated but then replied, "Thank you for seeing that. It's not something I deserve, maybe, but it means more than I can say." He wrote back, and soon enough we were exchanging messages. His name was Adam. He was a photographer, an artist in his own way, though his work focused on capturing moments as they were, without manipulation or idealization. There was a raw honesty to his philosophy that, at times, felt like a direct rebuke to my own history. He'd talk about how he found beauty in simplicity, how he believed art should elevate reality, not obscure it. And I found myself, against my better judgment, wanting to hear more of his thoughts. Our correspondence grew slowly, each message a careful step forward, tentative testing. It wasn't flirtation, it was something else entirely. A slow unfolding of understanding, a shared search for authenticity. I didn't tell him about the men from my past or my tangled path to self-awareness, and he didn't press me. But he asked questions about my art, about my vision, about the stories behind my pieces. And for the first time, I felt like I could answer without hiding behind layers of mystique or poetic phrases. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, forming yet another connection through my art. But this time, I approached it differently. Adam was different. There was no rush, no urgency to capture him on canvas, no compulsion to twist him into inspiration. I wanted to listen, to learn from him, to absorb his insights and for once, let myself be the one inspired without expectation. But one evening he surprised me with a message that jolted me back into my own tangled mess of memories. "You know," he wrote, "there's something almost haunting about your last series. I think you were apologizing for something. I can't shake the feeling that each piece is speaking to someone." I froze, my fingers hovering above the keyboard, unable to type. He'd seen it, the guilt, the apology woven through the lines and shadows of each portrait. I hadn't meant for anyone else to understand, to see that deeply into the work. Part of me wanted to deflect, to redirect the conversation, to avoid admitting the truth. But another part, the part that had finally started to grow tired of the secrecy, wanted to come clean. Taking a breath, I typed, "You're right. Those pieces, they were an apology. I was reaching out to people I'd hurt, trying to make amends through my art." His reply was instant, almost as if he'd been waiting for that admission. "You know, art is powerful that way. It lets you put pieces of yourself out there that words can't express. Sometimes, it even helps you understand things about yourself that you didn't realize before." There was a kindness in his response that disarmed me. He didn't pry further, didn't ask about the details, the messy specifics of what I'd done. Instead, he let my confession sit between us, allowing me the dignity of my own silence. And in that, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a weight I'd been carrying for months had finally started to lift. As the days passed, we continued our conversations, but they took on a new depth, a more profound honesty. Adam told me about his own struggles, his moments of doubt as an artist, the times he'd questioned whether his work was enough, whether he was enough. It was strange seeing myself reflected in his vulnerabilities. Here was someone who understood the pull of art, the endless need for self-expression, but who approached it with a humility I'd never allowed myself to feel. One weekend, he invited me to a gallery where he was showcasing his latest series. It was the first time we'd be meeting in person, and though I told myself it was simply a chance to see his work, my nerves betrayed me. I arrived early, wandering through the dimly lit space, taking in the photographs he'd captured. Each image was startlingly real, unguarded, like a glimpse into a hidden world. He didn't shy away from imperfections. He embraced them, capturing the quiet dignity of his subjects, their raw, unscripted moments. When he found me, standing in front of a particularly arresting portrait of a woman laughing, her face half in shadow, he gave me a quiet smile. "What do you think?" he asked. I didn't look at him. Instead, I focused on the photograph, letting its simplicity wash over me. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "There's no performance here. Just honesty." He nodded, his gaze never leaving the portrait. "That's what I strive for. To capture people as they are, without the need to turn them into something they're not." We stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between us. I felt exposed, raw in a way that no conversation, no artwork had ever made me feel. He didn't have to say it. The message was clear. I had spent years creating illusions, both in my art and in my relationships, molding people into shapes that suited my vision without truly seeing them. But with Adam, there was no need for illusion. There was just the bare, unvarnished truth. A fragile connection that existed without the weight of expectations. And in that moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was finally learning what it meant to create without taking, to love without molding, to be inspired without possession. For the first time I felt free. Our connection, cautious but profound, grew over the following months. I found myself sharing more with him than I'd shared with anyone, peeling back layers I hadn't known I'd buried so deeply. He became my confidant, my sounding board, the person I turned to when I struggled to find meaning in my work or direction in my life. And in his quiet, grounded presence, I found a sense of clarity I'd never thought possible. With him, I began to see art in a new way, not as a means to capture or possess, but as a way to reflect, to honor the beauty and complexity of others without trying to control it. My art changed, evolving from the stylized, idealized portraits of before into pieces that felt more like glimpses into reality, fragments of the world as it was, not as I wanted it to be. And through it all, Adam was there, a quiet, steady influence, reminding me of the power of truth, of the beauty in simplicity. I no longer needed to chase fleeting passions or shape people into muses. In him I'd found a source of inspiration that was real, lasting, and infinitely more fulfilling. In the end, I learned that art, like love, is not about possession or perfection. It's about seeing, truly seeing, and honoring the reality in front of you. And in that realization, I found not only my voice as an artist, but a sense of peace I'd never known. A peace I knew I'd carry with me, in every piece I created, and in every moment of my life. As my relationship with Adam deepened, my life seemed to settle into a rhythm that felt strangely foreign yet comforting. Gone were the highs and lows of my past, a past riddled with restless yearning and unfulfilled expectations. With Adam, there was no need to create an illusion. I didn't need to sculpt him into a source of inspiration, to wrest beauty from our connection by dressing it up in mystique and ambiguity. There was only him as he was, and somehow that simplicity felt more intoxicating than any fantasy I'd constructed. And yet, in quiet moments, the ghosts of my past choices would drift back. I'd think of Marcus, Nathan, and Daniel, the men who'd once inspired me, the faces I'd shaped into reflections of my own desires. I'd spent so long chasing a feeling, a sensation, that I'd never fully experienced the people themselves. I wondered where they were now, if they'd found their own peace, or if the scars I'd left lingered still. One evening, as Adam and I sat together on my tiny apartment's worn leather couch, he sensed my distraction. I was lost in thought, staring at the blank screen of my tablet, my fingers twitching as though wanting to sketch but unable to start. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly, his gaze steady and patient. I hesitated, caught between the urge to reveal my lingering regrets and the fear of shattering the fragile harmony we'd built. But with Adam, I'd come to realize that honesty, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. "It's the past," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "There are people I hurt in the name of art. I used them, turned them into objects of my own desire. I'm trying to move on, to create something real. But sometimes I wonder if those choices will always haunt me." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, compassionate. "Have you ever thought about reaching out to them?" he asked. The suggestion was simple, almost obvious, yet it felt like a revelation. For so long, I tried to atone through my art, hoping that putting out some abstract apology into the world would be enough. But I hadn't once considered the possibility of facing them directly, of offering a real, personal apology. "It's been months," I murmured, uncertainty lacing my voice. "Wouldn't that just reopen old wounds?" Adam shook his head gently. "Maybe. But sometimes the best way to heal is to acknowledge the pain openly. If you're truly sorry, let them know. At least then they'll have the choice to forgive or not." His words lingered with me long after he left that night. I knew he was right. I'd spent so long hiding behind the veil of art, letting my portraits do the talking, that I'd forgotten the power of direct connection, of speaking to someone face to face. It was terrifying, the thought of reopening those chapters, but perhaps it was also the only way to close them properly. The next day I sat down at my computer, my heart pounding as I typed out 3 emails. Each message was brief but heartfelt. I poured out my apologies, acknowledging the ways I'd used each of them, the damage I'd done in my selfish pursuit of inspiration. I didn't expect forgiveness, I explained, but I wanted them to know that I understood now, that I was sorry, not just in words but in the very core of my being. I hit send on each email with trembling fingers, unsure if I was prepared for the responses. The first reply came later that evening. It was from Nathan, the quiet, introspective man who'd once told me that being with me felt like stepping into a dream he didn't want to wake from. His message was kind, understanding. "I could see even back then that you were searching for something," he wrote. "I just never realized it wasn't me you were looking for. But thank you, Valerie. I appreciate the apology. I'm doing well now, and I hope you find peace too." His words brought an unexpected warmth to my chest. Nathan, with his calm acceptance, had offered a glimpse of grace I hadn't anticipated. For the first time I felt a sliver of closure, a tiny crack of light breaking through the darkness of my guilt. A few days later I heard from Marcus. His reply was less forgiving, tinged with anger that hadn't quite faded. You say you're sorry now, but that doesn't erase the fact that I felt used like some kind of muse in your twisted game, he wrote. I don't know if I can forgive you, and I don't know if I ever will. But thanks, I guess, for finally admitting what you did. His words stung, each one a reminder of the pain I'd caused. But I respected his response, even as it filled me with regret. Not everyone could offer forgiveness, and that was something I'd have to live with. The last reply came almost a week later. It was from Daniel, who had once been the most passionate, the most fervently entranced by our connection. His message was brief, and yet somehow it cut the deepest. I loved you, or at least I thought I did. But reading this, maybe you weren't really you with me. I hope you find who you really are. With each response, I felt layers of my guilt and shame peeling away, replaced by a bittersweet clarity. These men had been part of my journey, but they weren't mine to keep or to mold. They were separate, with lives and emotions I'd trampled in my obsession with the art. I hadn't realized how much closure I needed until those replies arrived, each one a tiny piece of freedom from my past. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself back into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. My art was no longer about capturing people or bending them to fit my desires. Instead, it became a reflection of my own growth, a tribute to the journey I'd taken, the mistakes I'd made, and the lessons I'd learned. Adam noticed the change, too. One evening, as he looked over a series of my latest pieces, he turned to me with a soft smile. "This feels like you," he murmured, tracing his fingers gently over the lines of a portrait I'd sketched of a faceless figure, framed by soft, shadowy light. "There's no performance here. Just honesty." His words brought a warmth to my cheeks, a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. He was right. For the first time, I was creating without artifice, without the need to manipulate or idealize. I was simply expressing, letting the art flow from me without restraint. With Adam's support, I continued down this path, each piece a step further from my past, and a step closer to a future defined not by illusion, but by truth. And slowly I began to trust myself again, to trust that I could create without hurting, to believe that I could love without taking. Looking back, I could see the woman I'd been, the choices I'd made, and the people I'd hurt. But I no longer saw her as a stranger or as someone to be despised. She was simply a part of me, a chapter in a larger story that was still unfolding. And as I turned the page, I knew that whatever came next would be written with a gentler hand, one that understood the value of seeing others not as muses or sources of inspiration, but as whole, complete beings, beautiful in their own right. And in that realization, I finally found the peace I'd been searching for all along. Months flowed by like gentle waves, each one bringing a new sense of calm and quiet certainty that I'd never known before. My art continued to evolve, as did my life with Adam. We hadn't defined ourselves with grand gestures or labels, and yet he was always there, quietly steady, providing a kind of support I hadn't thought I deserved. There was a deep simplicity to our connection, an ease that made me feel, for the first time, like I was allowed to be just myself. No more mystery, no more layers of artifice or the need to create drama. Just a shared understanding, a quiet acceptance. With him, I found myself experiencing moments I'd once taken for granted. Strolls through art galleries on rainy afternoons, conversations over coffee that lasted hours, laughter over nothing in particular. These moments were so ordinary, so real, and yet they felt like the very thing I'd been trying to capture all those years. They were art in their own way, untouched and beautifully simple. One rainy Sunday, as we sat in a corner booth of a little cafe, watching raindrops streak down the windows, Adam leaned back and looked at me with a curious smile. "I was thinking," he started, his gaze gentle but probing, "you've spent so much time capturing people, creating these incredible portraits. Have you ever thought about making one of yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I'd painted countless faces over the years, faces of friends, lovers, strangers. But the thought of creating a self-portrait had never once crossed my mind. My art had always been about others, or rather about what I projected onto them. To turn that lens inward, to create something that was just about me, it felt foreign, vulnerable. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, I never have. Feels, I don't know, exposing, I guess." Adam nodded thoughtfully, as though he understood the hesitation that lay beneath my words. "Maybe that's exactly why you should do it," he said softly. "Maybe it's time to see yourself the way you've tried to see everyone else." His words lingered with me, like a subtle echo that wouldn't fade. That evening I found myself sitting at my desk, staring at the blank canvas on my screen, my stylus poised but unmoving. What would a self-portrait even look like? How could I capture myself in a way that was honest, free of the illusions and facades I'd once woven around others? I started with my eyes. I'd painted eyes 1,000 times before, each one different, each one unique. But these eyes felt strange, foreign, like they belonged to someone I hadn't fully met yet. They held a softness I hadn't expected, a quiet vulnerability that surprised me. As I worked, I saw traces of the woman I'd been, the artist who had once crafted illusions and blurred the line between love and art. But I also saw something new: strength, a kind of resilience that had come from facing my mistakes, learning from them and finding a way forward. Hours slipped by, and by the time I set down my stylus, dawn was breaking outside my window. I looked at the finished piece, my heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and pride. There on the screen was a version of myself I hadn't recognized before, both the artist and the woman beneath the art, no longer separated by the need to create a facade. It felt raw, almost startlingly honest, but it was me. And for the first time, I felt like I could look at my own reflection without flinching. When Adam saw the portrait later that day, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze softening as he took it in. Finally, he looked at me, a quiet pride in his eyes. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "It's you." Hearing those words, I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of affirmation that I'd never experienced before. I'd spent so long seeking validation from others, molding myself to fit what I thought they wanted to see. But in that moment, with Adam's steady gaze and my own reflection staring back at me, I felt, for the first time, complete. Not perfect, not without flaws, but whole. From then on, my art took on a new life. I no longer painted people as mere objects of fascination or desire. I painted them as they were, with their own unique complexities and imperfections. Each piece became a study in empathy, a tribute to the beauty of simply being human. I no longer sought to capture people as extensions of myself, but as reflections of the world around me, of the shared experiences, the quiet moments, the emotions that made each of us both ordinary and extraordinary. Over time, my work began to attract attention again, but this time it was different. The comments and messages weren't about intrigue or mystery. They were about connection. People would reach out, sharing how they saw themselves in my portraits, how the simplicity and honesty of each piece resonated with them. There was no frenzy, no viral fame. Just a steady, growing appreciation that felt real, grounded. One evening, as I sorted through these messages, a particular one stood out to me. It was from a woman named Lila, who had written a heartfelt note about how my art had helped her through a difficult time, how the rawness of my portraits had made her feel seen, understood. She asked if I ever took commissions, saying that she wanted to capture a moment of vulnerability she'd experienced, a way of reclaiming her own story. Her words touched me deeply, and I found myself saying yes. Over the next few weeks, Lila and I exchanged stories, each conversation a step toward understanding who she was and the emotion she wanted to convey. I realized then that I was no longer creating art for myself, or even for the people in my immediate life. I was creating for others, for people who needed a voice, a mirror, a way to see themselves without judgment. This new chapter of my art brought a sense of purpose I'd never known. Each commission was a journey into someone else's world, a chance to honor their story, their essence. I wasn't drawing faces for the sake of allure or mystery. I was capturing lives, fragments of souls, in ways that felt real and authentic. And in doing so, I felt a growing connection to the people who entrusted me with their stories, a quiet respect that transcended any desire to control or possess. Through it all, Adam remained by my side, his presence a constant reminder of the journey I'd taken, the person I was becoming. Our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated, rooted in mutual respect and understanding. He saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and loved me not in spite of them but because of them. And with him, I learned to see myself with that same acceptance. One evening, as we walked along the river, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, the air filled with the sound of lapping water and the distant hum of the city. "You know," he said softly, "you once told me that you were afraid of creating without capturing people. But look at you now. You're painting life as it is, not as you want it to be. And it's beautiful." His words brought a warmth to my heart, a quiet joy that settled deep within me. I had spent so long searching for meaning, for validation, for something that would make me feel whole. But in the end, I realized that the answers weren't in other people or in fleeting moments of inspiration. They were in me, in the ability to see the world, to honor the beauty around me, to capture life as it was, messy, imperfect, but breathtakingly real. As the seasons changed, I continued to paint, each piece a tribute to the lessons I'd learned, to the people I'd loved and lost, to the moments of clarity that had shaped me. My art became a reflection of my journey, a story of growth and forgiveness, of finding peace in the ordinary and beauty in the truth. And in that journey, I found a sense of fulfillment that no viral fame or fleeting romance could ever give. Adam and I continued to walk hand in hand, each step a quiet testament to the life we'd built together. A life rooted not in illusions or half-truths, but in honesty, simplicity, and love. And as we walked into the fading light, I felt a profound sense of peace, a contentment that came not from being seen by others, but from finally seeing myself. As our life together settled into a beautiful rhythm, I began to feel as if I were living in a painting of my own creation, a world colored not by fantasy, but by the warmth of real connection. Adam and I shared a quiet intimacy that had become the foundation of my life, a steady presence that calmed the restless artist within me. Our moments were simple: shared mornings over coffee, lazy afternoons sprawled on the floor with sketchbooks open, evenings spent reading or talking in a low, comforting murmur as the world outside dimmed into twilight. But even in this peace, a sense of creative purpose simmered inside me. My art had taken on a new direction, evolving into a way of connecting with others, rather than merely capturing them. I started receiving more commissions, each one a story, a glimpse into the life of someone who wanted to feel seen. I took them on slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to dive into each story without the pressure of time or perfection. The messages people sent me were open, vulnerable, as if the very act of asking for a portrait had unlocked something raw within them. One day, I received a request that both challenged and inspired me in a way I hadn't anticipated. A man named James reached out, asking if I'd consider doing a portrait of his late wife. She'd passed away a few years prior, and he wanted something to capture the essence of who she'd been. A woman full of life and laughter, whose absence still lingered in his everyday. His message was simple, almost tentative, as if he feared his request might be too much to ask of anyone. I felt a weight settle over me as I read his words. This was a responsibility, a sacred trust, a way to help someone preserve a memory they could no longer touch. I'd always been the artist who captured the living, the flawed and complex faces that still breathed and evolved. But this, capturing someone no longer here, felt like reaching across time, creating a bridge between the living and the lost. I felt both daunted and honored. After accepting the commission, I asked James to tell me stories about his wife. Over the course of several emails, he painted a vivid picture of her, each story layered with a quiet ache, but also with a radiant joy. She had been a teacher, a lover of literature with a laugh that, as he described, could light up the whole room. She had loved sunflowers and warm summer evenings, red wine and old jazz records. Every detail added depth to the woman she had been, and I began to feel her presence, almost as if she were sitting beside me, her energy filling my quiet studio. For days I immersed myself in James's memories, allowing myself to imagine her fully. I wanted to capture not just her features, but her essence, the warmth, the light, the vibrancy of her spirit. I sketched slowly, pausing often, letting her image emerge gradually, each stroke of the brush deliberate and thoughtful. It felt different from anything I'd ever created. This wasn't about me, it wasn't even about my art. It was about preserving something fragile, something that deserved reverence. When I finally finished the portrait, I felt a wave of both relief and sadness. She was there on the canvas, a face I had never met, yet somehow I felt as if I knew her. Her smile was soft but alive, her eyes filled with a quiet mischief, the faintest suggestion of laughter hiding in the lines around them. I looked at her, and for the first time, I truly understood the power of art as a way to capture love, to give form to a feeling too vast for words. I sent the portrait to James, holding my breath as I waited for his response. Days passed in silence, and I wondered if perhaps the portrait had stirred too much emotion, if I'd somehow missed the mark, or if it had reopened wounds that time hadn't fully healed. But then his email arrived. "Valerie," he wrote. When I opened the file and saw her face, it felt like she was in the room with me again. "You captured something I thought I'd lost." The way she looked at me, the way her eyes crinkled just before she laughed. "Thank you for bringing her back, if only in this small way. I'll treasure this forever." His words brought a lump to my throat, and for a long time I sat in front of the screen unable to reply. I hadn't just created a portrait, I'd given him a piece of her back, a sliver of memory to hold on to in the years to come. It was an intimacy I hadn't expected to feel with a stranger, a reminder of the ways we are all bound together, how art can bridge the spaces between life and loss. That night, as I shared the story with Adam, he took my hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're helping people heal, Val. This is more than art. It's a gift." His words stayed with me, grounding me, reminding me of the new purpose my work had taken on. And with each new commission that came, I approached it with the same sense of reverence, the understanding that this wasn't just about creating beautiful faces. It was about honoring lives, capturing the moments that made people who they were. Over time, I began to notice a shift in how I saw the world around me. The faces I encountered each day, the barista at the coffee shop, the elderly man who fed the pigeons in the park, the young couple laughing as they walked their dog. All of them held a story, a unique depth I'd once overlooked in my pursuit of fleeting inspiration. The world was full of moments, ordinary and extraordinary, waiting to be seen, to be understood. And for the first time I felt like I was truly seeing it. My relationship with Adam grew deeper, the quiet moments between us expanding into a shared life, one rooted in a mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. We didn't need grand declarations or elaborate plans. Our love was woven into the fabric of our daily lives, in the way he'd leave a cup of coffee by my sketchbook in the morning, or the way I'd find his handwritten notes tucked into my art supplies. These small gestures became our language, our way of expressing a love that was as steady as it was profound. One evening, as we lay side by side, gazing at the stars from his apartment's rooftop, Adam turned to me with a question that took me by surprise. "Val," he said, his voice soft but steady, "do you ever think about the future? About us?" I looked at him, feeling a warmth spread through my chest, a quiet certainty that I hadn't felt before. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think I'd be alone forever, that no one could ever really see me. But with you, I don't feel like I have to hide." He smiled, reaching for my hand and lacing his fingers with mine. "Good," he said, his gaze tender, "because I want to keep seeing you in all the ways you are." As we sat there, wrapped in the quiet of the night, I realized that this was everything I'd been searching for. An art that connected, a love that didn't demand perfection, a life that felt as real as the faces I now painted. And in that moment, beneath the vastness of the starlit sky, I knew that I had finally come home, to myself, to my art, and to the man who had taught me what it meant to truly see and be seen. In the end, it wasn't the allure of fame or the thrill of admiration that brought me fulfillment. It was this, a life that was beautifully simple, honestly shared, and deeply felt. And as I leaned into Adam, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine, I knew that my story was only just beginning, painted not with illusions, but with the vibrant, messy, breathtaking colors of the truth. As the seasons turned and life settled into a steady rhythm, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought me here. The mistakes, the revelations, the growth. My art was no longer about seeking validation or hiding behind crafted illusions. It had transformed into a channel for connection, a way to honor the lives of others and the simple beauty of truth. Each piece I created felt like a quiet thank you, a tribute to the people who had, knowingly or unknowingly, shaped my path. My commissions grew into a word-of-mouth phenomenon, each one introducing me to another story, another life, another face. It wasn't a glamorous career by any means, but it was meaningful. And in each piece, I tried to infuse the wisdom I'd gained, the compassion that had slowly but surely taken root in my work. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by the ghosts of my past mistakes. Instead, they were part of me, woven into each brushstroke, each line, each moment of silent reflection. And through it all, Adam remained by my side, grounding me with his quiet strength. He continued to photograph life as it was, capturing those small, unpolished moments that I now understood as the true heart of existence. Together we built a life that felt like art. Honest, intimate, imperfect but complete. Every shared sunrise, every quiet evening together, every laugh and conversation became its own small masterpiece, a mosaic of memories that I knew would stay with me forever. One night, as we sat in our cozy, softly lit apartment, Adam turned to me with a look that was both serious and tender. "Val," he began, reaching for my hand, "I know we've talked about the future before, but I want you to know, this is my future. You are my future. I want to spend my life with you." His words settled over me like a warm blanket, filling me with a quiet joy that left me speechless. Here was a man who saw me, truly saw me, and loved me as I was. He wasn't asking me to be a muse or a source of inspiration. He was asking me to be his partner, to share a life filled with ordinary moments that we could make extraordinary together. I looked at him, my heart swelling with a gratitude that was hard to put into words. "Yes," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I want that too. With you. Forever." In that moment I felt a sense of peace unlike anything I'd ever known. It was as if my entire life, all the mistakes, the regrets, the lessons, had been leading me here, to this simple promise of love, a love built on truth and acceptance. Our life together unfolded quietly, beautifully, each day adding a new layer to the canvas we were creating. My art continued to grow, shaped not by fleeting passions or the need to possess, but by a steady, enduring love. Adam's influence was there in every piece, a reminder of the man who had shown me the beauty of honesty, the strength of vulnerability, the power of seeing and being seen. As I looked around our life, a life filled with laughter, art, and the quiet joy of simply being, I knew that this was the truest art I had ever created. And as we walked hand in hand into the future, I felt a profound sense of contentment, knowing that I had finally found what I'd been searching for all along. A love that felt like home, and a life that was beautifully, irrevocably real.